What's up guys, and welcome to another Porsche 911 comparison. Today we're looking at two prior generations of facelifted 911. We're currently sitting in a 2012 997.2 911 Carrera GTS Cabriolet, and we'll be comparing this against a 2017 991.2 base Carrera. Both of these cars on the market today cost around $70,000 to $90,000 US. So which one is better to drive and which one is a better all-around 911 package? So Sonny, the owner of this 997.2, mentioned that the original MSRP was $128,000 back in 2012, and the option list, PDK transmission, which is the first generation PDK, platinum silver metallic paint, the 12-way power seats, heated and ventilated, Porsche dynamic lighting system, etc., etc. But what you need to know mechanically and the things that affect the driving dynamics is that the GTS comes standard with PASM, which is Porsche Active Suspension Management, Porsche Sports Exhaust, which is valved, and you can control it with this button here, or when you enable Sport or Sport Plus mode. And this car comes with the RS Spider wheels, which are 19-inch all-around, staggered setup, 235 front tire, 305 rear, and the engine is carried over from the 997.2 Carrera S. So it's a 3.8-liter, naturally aspirated, flat six, but it's been tuned for the GTS to produce 408 horsepower. We'll be reviewing those cars later today as well. And torque is at 310 pound-feet. This thing has a 7,500 RPM redline. But guess what? That 991.2, despite having 38 fewer horsepower, it is turbocharged and probably with a lot more torque. So we'll see how that affects the overall driving enjoyment. Now, given that this is a cabriolet, it does weigh a couple hundred pounds more than the coupe, so sitting in at right around 3,400 pounds. This has strut front suspension and multi-link rear. Let's take this thing for a drive and use this as the baseline and then see if you should spend your $70,000 to $90,000 on the newer car. I've always been a big fan of the 997.2 generation, specifically interior. It is a bit dated looking, but I would say it's still a classy design 12 years later. Actually, over 12 years later, as the 997.2 came out in 2009. Of course, this has hydraulic power steering, the last generation of 911 to offer that before they all moved to EPS. Let's see if that is enough to give this car the edge over the 991.2. So we'll put it into Sport Plus mode, but we'll turn the dampers into the softer setting. And one corner is all you need to be able to appreciate this old school hydraulic power steering rack. Even without super sticky tires, this steering rack just communicates so much about the road surface. Gotta love that flat six howl. Although it is a little bit muted, I would say, even with the Porsche Sports Exhaust, you certainly don't get the high RPM zing and induction note of a GT3. Really good brakes. Of course, the Carrera S gets the bigger rotors compared to the base Carrera, and the GTS gets the brakes from the Carrera S. The GTS is basically a more driver-focused version of the Carrera S. Everything has been taken up a notch. This also has an LSD on the rear axle as standard. Even though this is a convertible and heavier than the coupe, it still feels pretty light on its feet. 3,400 pounds, not particularly light, but the way this car rotates is really nice. This PDK transmission, it's certainly not as impressive as a modern PDK. You drive something like a GT3 RS, then you hop into this, and this PDK will feel sedated. The shifts aren't that snappy compared to the newer stuff. Let me demonstrate that here. First gear. I mean, it's still properly quick, but there's a little bit of a dip in the torque between upshifts, and you can definitely feel it. The gearing's a little bit long as well. I think second gear goes to over 70. So on a canyon road, despite having a 7-speed transmission, you're still mostly in second gear, sometimes third. But the overall balance of this car is really good. It is rear-engined. It doesn't hide that fact. There's no fancy rear-wheel steering here. But it's still fundamentally a pretty balanced car for what it is. You would have to be on a racetrack or pushing really hard in the canyons to feel a noticeable amount of understeer on turn-in. And of course, the corner exit traction of this car is brilliant. Oh yeah. I just wish this had a little bit more intake sound. Maybe the aftermarket can help there. It's just such a well-rounded sports car. There's really so little to complain about. This car might not have any incredible strengths, but I would say no real weaknesses either. As a everyday drivable sports car, really hard to find fault with it. It's not a razor-edged track machine or handling weapon, but that's what the GT cars are for. The GTS has always been about being kind of a bridge between the regular Carrera models and the GT models, but still being closer to the regular Carrera models. Of course, there still is a Carrera before that GTS, so that's what you'd expect. A little bit of cowl shake going over the bumps here at speed. That's because this is a convertible. It's less rigid than the coupe. See right there, that upshift from second to third was a little bit sluggish, just a little bit. But lots of grip. Such a well-rounded sports car. And even though this costs $70,000+, probably closer to 80 or 90 if you want a really clean coupe with a manual transmission, it still is an appealing proposition because this offers that slightly analog feel compared to something newer. That hydraulic steering that gives you so much feedback about the road. This more classic interior that's not full of touchscreens. And the fact that the 997 is a significantly smaller car than the 991. Compared to that 991.2, the wheelbase is actually 4 inches shorter, and it feels so much more compact, especially driving on a tight road. Not a huge fan of these PASM dampers in these early 997 models. If you turn it on, you just feel every little bump, but it doesn't necessarily feel more composed in the corners or flatter in the corners, if that makes sense. The damping just seems to get unnecessarily aggressive. Second gear. Now that's the other thing I don't like about this first generation PDK is that even in manual mode, it will automatically upshift when you hit red line. See, with the PASM dampers on, it just becomes unpleasant. So that's the 997.2. The 997 generation, in general, has always been one of my favorite generations of Porsche 911 for good reason. It's the right size. I love the way they look. They have these naturally aspirated engines, hydraulic power steering, and they hold value pretty well. But now it's time to jump into that 991.2 base Carrera and see if for your same $70,000 to $90,000, the newer car offers a better driving experience. All right, so we're now in the 2017 991.2 generation base Carrera, also with a PDK transmission. The owner, Sushil, mentioned this one is spec'd out. Porsche sports exhaust, 14-way power seats, Porsche dynamic lighting system plus with full LED headlights, and 20-inch Carrera S wheels. 3-liter twin turbocharged flat 6 engine. So downsized compared to the 997.2, 370 horsepower, 331 pound-feet of torque. So it's down 38 horsepower, but it does have more torque. And being a coupe, it's a little bit lighter at just over 3,200 pounds. Interior is definitely a lot more modern. I actually think the 991.2 has my favorite interior of all the 911s because it merges the touchscreen infotainment with a lot of physical buttons that you can use to easily access basic things like your climate control, heated and ventilated seats, and we have dedicated buttons for the suspension setting, the exhaust, the sunroof. It's just a really good balance between new school and old school. Sushil did add some aesthetic mods to this. I'll put the full list in the video description. The only arguably mechanical mod is the Essex J Hook 350mm brake rotors. Love that the seat moves back when you turn the car off, and the steering wheel gets out of the way as well. We're gonna throw this thing into manual mode. For the 991.2, you now pull to upshift, which is fantastic. We'll have the dampers in the softer setting to start, but we'll have Porsche Sports exhaust turned on. The first thing I'm noticing is this car does feel quite a bit bigger. The interior is more spacious as a result, which is a nice benefit if this is going to be a daily driver, but also it feels a little bit wider and more cumbersome on the road. Oh wow, that's a lot more mid-range torque. The steering, I'm noticing, is much lighter than that 997.2. This is electric power steering, of course, but you know what? I'm actually sensing quite a good amount of information through the wheel. It's not as brimming full of feedback as that 997.2 rack. Also, ergonomically, these paddle shifters mounted behind the wheel are much closer to the center of the wheel. So I have to reach a little bit more in order to reach the paddles. Okay, that difference in straight line acceleration is actually quite huge. This has less power, but so much more torque that it makes up for it on a road like this, where you're not able to always keep it in the top part of the rev range. This car just feels so much quicker. And the suspension feels so much better. It's so much more composed. Let's put this into the stiffer setting now. Oh yeah, this suspension is so much better even in the firmer setting. It doesn't feel over damped like that 997.2. This is much more composed, and the chassis feels more rigid as well. Obviously cabrio versus coupe, or coupe, depending on which side of the pond you're from. First gear. Oh yeah. The gearing, in terms of the gear ratios, at least for second and third gear, feel similar between these two cars, but because this engine has so much more torque, the gear ratios are less of a problem here. You get through second gear so much quicker. The brakes feel excellent, even though these are just the base Carrera brakes, not the Carrera S. This is the altogether more confidence-inspiring car. Almost killed a squirrel there. It looks like he got away. Now look at this. So much mid-corner composure. And so much steering feel. Honestly, in some of the higher speed corners, the steering gets even better. It really... oh yeah, it communicates so much about what the front tires are doing. It doesn't load up as much in the corners in terms of the weighting compared to that 997, but I get arguably just as much information in the high-speed corners. Maybe a little less information in the low-speed corners. Still tons of traction because it is a rear engine layout car with all the weight over that rear axle, but it's less rear engine than the 997. The engine has been moved a little bit forward. You still do get some of that pendulum physics, but it's definitely less pronounced here. This suspension though, so much better, so much more composed. And the PASM actually makes sense in this car. It doesn't just become a pogo stick over the bumps. It gives you that firmness that you want when attacking corners without reducing the compliance over bumps. In terms of this PDK, other than this annoying paddle placement on the wheel, there's a big difference between this and the 997.2. The shifts are quicker, but what's even more noticeable is how seamless the shifts are. I don't feel nearly as much of a dip in torque between shifts. Actually, I don't feel any dip in torque. It's just instant. You get really deep into the brakes, even with the base brakes. I guess these Essex rotors might offer a little bit of improvement, but I doubt it if these are just on stock pads. Oh yeah. I can just attack corners so much harder in this car. Wow, what a big difference. I was not expecting this. I've always just loved the 997 generation, and with a GTS model, you'd expect that to be the cream of the crop before you move into a GT3. But honestly, the 991.2 is a whole other level of just engineering excellence. Everything just feels so much more dialed in. The crazy thing is, at high speed, even going straight, the steering feel just becomes enhanced. Like you feel every little camber in the road, every little bump. Look at the way it handled that bump. The 997 did not do that. This is so much better damped. This is a surprising one for me, guys. I honestly expected the 991 to feel a little bit numb compared to the 997, but that's actually not the case. The steering feel on this is so good. And honestly, if it were my $70,000 to $90,000, I think I just go for the newer car. Even though I still prefer the looks of the 997 and the engine sound with a few aftermarket upgrades, I think still does sound better than this turbocharged unit. But out of the box, this definitely is the more impressive vehicle. And to top it off, it has the creature comforts, has more space. You can drive it in comfort every single day. So let me know what you think of this comparison. Which would you spend your $70,000 to $90,000 on? A big thank you to Sunny and to Sushil. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.